Welcome back to The Deep Dive, your shortcut to being thoroughly well-informed about the most fascinating people, ideas, and events shaping our world.
Today, we are diving deep.
We are. Today, we're strapping ourselves into the piano bench of a true legend, a man whose sound was so explosive, it really redefined the entire structure of 20th century popular music.
We're talking about Richard Wayne Penniman, who you will almost certainly know by the title that he earned, he fought for, and fiercely defended his whole life, the architect of rock and roll.
Yeah, and that moniker, architect, it can sound like hyperbole when you apply it to musicians, right?
Oh, for sure.
But in this case, it might actually be an understatement. We're talking about a figure who was arguably the single most flamboyant, innovative, and profoundly contradictory foundational artist of his era.
Absolutely. He was a creature of chaos and conversion, glitter and gospel. His life was lived at 100 miles an hour, constantly swinging between the sacred and the profane.
So the source material we've pulled together for this deep dive is just vast. It spans his incredibly challenging early life in the segregated South through multiple career shifts that, saw him abandoning secular stardom multiple times for this fervent evangelism.
And we have notes here detailing his complex personal identity, his radical presentation, his pioneering sound, and his absolutely massive, measurable influence on generations of rock, soul, and pop stars. I mean, it's an influence that stretches from the Beatles all the way to Bruno Mars.
So our mission today is pretty clear. We're going to try and uncover the surprising and often scandalous origins of his unique driving sound.
Yeah, and we'll analyze the social dynamite that was released by his integrated performances, especially in the highly segregated 1950s.
And maybe most compellingly, we're going to explore that profound duality, that battle between the high-voltage showman and the fire and brimstone minister that drove his multiple dramatic retirements and, his equally dramatic comebacks over 7 decades.
And if you need just a single initial insight into why he earned that title, architect, you have to look directly at his breakthrough sound in the mid-1950s.
Okay.
It was this explosive and really technologically innovative combination. You had the frenetic two-handed piano playing, a driving, pounding backbeat. There was a fundamental departure from the old boogie-woogie shuffle.
Right.
And then you have those powerful, utterly raspy, emotionally charged vocals. That sound, it wasn't just a flavor of rock and roll. It physically established the rhythmic template for the whole genre.
Which is why he was, of course, part of the very first group of inductees into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986.
Exactly. He had to be.
Okay, let's unpack this and start at the beginning, in a place steeped in contradiction. The architect of this sound was born Richard Wayne Penniman on December 5th, 1932.
In Macon, Georgia, the third of 12 children.
And immediately, right from birth, you see that potent, constant mix of piety and prohibition right there in his family life.
That tension is absolutely crucial to understanding him. His roots were deeply religious. His father, Charles Bud Penniman, was a church deacon and a brick mason, and his mother was a devoted member of the New Hope Baptist Church. But at the same time, Bud Penniman had this successful sideline selling bootlegged moonshine, and he owned a local nightclub called the Tip Inn.
Wow. So the church choir and the jukebox were literally under the same family roof.
Exactly. That constant friction was the atmosphere Richard Wayne Penniman inhaled from day one.
And Richard himself was naturally drawn to the most dynamic and expressive end of faith. He loved the charismatic worship, the loud responses, and the live music you'd find in the Pentecostal churches.
Yeah, he later recalled that his neighbors used gospel songs all day long during segregation just to keep a positive outlook and feel their connection with God. They were literally using music to wash away their daily trials.
And he was known as a mischievous kid. They called him Lil Richard because he was so small, but he was gifted with this incredibly loud singing voice.
So loud, in fact, that he was once stopped from singing in church for screaming and hollering. They gave him the nickname Warhawk.
But underneath all this musicality and religious fervor, there were some profound personal challenges that really shaped his need for a persona.
Yeah, and they were really painful. Richard had a slight birth deformity that affected one of his legs, which caused an unusual gait. And he was just routinely mocked and ridiculed for his effeminate appearance and his mannerisms.
The sources confirm he was subjected to brutal homosexual jokes.
And this early experience of being marginalized and crucially being punished by his own father. That was traumatic. His father eventually kicked him out at 15 for wearing makeup and clothing.
And his father explicitly said Richard spoiled it because I was gay.
Yeah, that familial rejection became the fuel for his defiance. It's really central to his story.
It's fascinating how he almost weaponized that trauma. The flamboyance that defined him, the hair, the makeup, the wild clothes, it was all forged in this crucible of spiritual music, familial disapproval, and personal defiance.
And the path out of Macon, it started with one of his greatest idols, Sister Rosetta Tharpe,
What a legend in her own right.
an absolute pioneer.
Mm.
So when Richard was just 14, this is October 1947, Tharpe, the pioneering gospel and rock guitarist, she overheard him singing her songs before a performance at the Macon City Auditorium.
And she didn't ignore him.
No. She invited him to open her show. Just an astonishing opportunity for a 14-year-old. She even paid him afterwards. And that was the moment. That was when Richard decided that the validation he couldn't get at home, he would seek and conquer on the professional stage.
But the road to fame was anything but street. It didn't go right through the mainstream recording industry. It went straight through the minstrel circuit.
Precisely. By 1949, Richard had left home for good and joined Dr. Nabil's traveling show. He was really inspired by the showman's turbans and capes.
And this is where he started performing in drag, right? Under the name Princess Lavone.
That's right. And this exposure to the vaudeville and minstrel circuits, working alongside figures like Sugarfoot Sam from Alabama, it gave him this necessary mastery of pure theatrical showmanship.
You mean like running on and off stage, interacting wildly with the crowd?
Yeah, developing the dramatic timing he'd soon unleash on rock and roll. It was his training ground.
He eventually settles in Atlanta, and this is where he moves firmly into R&B. He saw these high-energy showmen like Roy Brown and, crucially, the openly flamboyant Billy Wright.
Billy Wright became a pivotal mentor. He was the one who advised Richard to use pancake makeup and adopt that high, long-haired pompadour.
And Richard later noted that he wore the flamboyant makeup for protection. It's a really interesting point.
It is. He reasoned that by exaggerating his presentation, white men wouldn't think he was after the white girls, which he believed made touring and interacting with promoters and venue owners easier in the rigidly segregated South.
So it was a mask of defiance, but also a shield of calculated self-preservation.
Exactly. But despite this developing persona and this high-octane stage reputation, early success on record was completely elusive.
His initial recordings were what, commercially disappointing?
Utterly. He recorded 8 sides for RCA Victor, starting in 1951. One of them, Every Hour, was a regional hit in Georgia, but it failed to chart nationally.
Because they still sounded pretty traditional.
Right. They were still rooted in jump blues and gospel. They just didn't have that radical sound that would make him famous. He moved to Peacock Records in 1953, recorded 8 more sides, some with Johnny Otis, but again, nothing truly broke out nationally.
So this period of disappointment is so important. He has the persona, he has the performance, but he doesn't have the hit record.
Which leads to this moment of total disillusionment. It forces him to return to Macon in 1954, desperate enough to take a job washing dishes for Greyhound Lines.
Wow.
But that low point, it provided the necessary mental break that led directly to the ignition of rock and roll. Well, while he was back in Macon, he met a musician named Escarita, whose own flamboyant style and extremely dynamic, aggressive piano playing deeply influenced Richard's developing approach.
So he gets this new input, this new energy.
Exactly. Fueled by this, he records a new demo tape and sends it to Specialty Records in 1955, spurred on by a suggestion from Lloyd Price.
And the owner, Art Roop, and producer Robert Bumps Blackwell, they initially thought Richard could be their answer to Ray Charles.
Right, they wanted a sophisticated blues-rooted singer. But Richard was insistent. He preferred the jumping sound of Fats Domino.
So they get him into J&M Studios in New Orleans with Domino's session musicians, including the legendary drummer Earl Palmer.
But the initial sessions were a complete flop. Richard just wasn't delivering the sophisticated blues they wanted.
And this is the historical hinge moment.
This is it. Frustrated by the lack of material and the session's failure, Blackwell and Richard took a break to the Dewdrop Inn nightclub to relax. And Richard, just blowing off steam, launches into this risque, high-speed, utterly chaotic piece of dirty blues he had been singing on the circuit.
The song was Tutti Frutti.
That was the song. And Blackwell, being a seasoned producer, instantly recognized the potential power, the sheer visceral energy. But the lyrics were sexually explicit and crude. They were completely unusable for commercial radio.
Right.
The original lyrics were just too much, even for the R&B market at the time. So Blackwell quickly hired a local songwriter, Dorothy Labostri, to clean up the content while retaining that raw energy.
And she's the one who transformed the crude lines into that iconic, nonsensical, and utterly infectious chorus we know today.
Paired with that famous opening vocal explosion.
And that transformation worked like a charm. Released in November 1955, Tutti Frutti was an instant phenomenon.
It hit #2 on the R&B chart. It crossed over to #21 on the Billboard Top 100, sold 1 million copies. The Library of Congress later inducted the recording, citing his unique vocalizing over the irresistible beat, announced a new era in music.
It was the culmination of everything. His gospel screams, his R&B grit, his personal defiance, all crystallized into the pure, undeniable sound of rock and roll.
And that ignition point led to a stunning, just a rapid-fire peak of success.
Yeah.
For the next 3 years, Richard scored 15 more hit singles, maintaining a blistering pace.
I mean, think about this. In less than 3 years, we get Long Tall Sally,
Which hit #1 R&B in 1956.
Rip It Up, Ready Teddy, Lucille, and Keep a Knockin', which became his first top 10 single on the overall Billboard Top 100.
The sources confirm an unbelievable pace. 7 U.S. singles released in 1956 alone. He was just pumping out hits like an industrial complex.
And what defined this era, as Specialty Records owner Art Roop noted, was that Richard was very dynamic, completely uninhibited, unpredictable, wild.
Oh, yeah. He wasn't like the comparatively sedate performers of the previous generation. He was pure, raw electricity on stage.
And his stage antics became his signature. They distinguish him from every other performer out there.
We're talking about lifting his leg onto the piano, climbing on top of it mid-song, running across the stage like a madman.
All while throwing souvenirs to the audience and dressed in these dazzling suits, studded with multicolored stones and sequins.
His drummer, Charles Connor, he vividly recalled a show in Baltimore in 1956 where women started throwing their undergarments on stage.
And Richard claims that was the very first time that had ever happened to any major artist.
He essentially invented the trope of the rock star spectacle.
And this wild, uninhibited style wasn't just entertaining. It had massive seismic sociological consequences. Richard is cited as one of the first truly successful Black crossover artists.
His package tours, which included other pioneering Black artists like Fats Domino and Chuck Berry, they shattered the color line in public venues simply because the music was too compelling for anyone to ignore.
It was absolutely revolutionary, especially in the South.
You know, while venues often maintained segregation, Blacks forced into the balcony, whites on the main floor, Richard's music was so infectious, so driven, that audiences physically began to mix and dance together in defiance of social rules.
And the sources highlight that this integrated audience response was terrifying to segregationists.
Oh, completely. We have notes citing local supremacist groups like the North Alabama White Citizens Council broadcasting warnings against rock and roll because it was unholy and brought the races together.
When a powerful political group explicitly denounces your art for destroying segregation, you know you're changing the culture.
You absolutely do.
And Richard's own defense of his flamboyance, it adds this fascinating, kind of sad layer of complexity to this discussion about race and identity in the 50s.
Right, that he became more flamboyant on stage so that white men wouldn't assume he was after the white girls, which he believed made things easier for him during segregation.
A calculated, protective performance.
Yeah, designed to deflect the racialized sexual threat that was inherent in the hypersexualized landscape of rock and roll.
But despite the phenomenal success and the cultural revolution he sparked, we can't overlook the immediate mainstream appropriation of his sound.
Oh no. The safer white artists, primarily Pat Boone, Elvis Presley, and Bill Haley, they immediately covered his songs. Pat Boone's cover of Tutti Frutti actually charted higher than Richard's original.
Which was a brutal financial and cultural injustice, but so common in that era.
And it brings us to the financial reality, which is so often hidden beneath the flash. That appropriation and injustice, it leads directly to the abrupt short-circuiting of his career in 1957.
This is where the high-voltage artist hits a spiritual wall.
A massive one. In October 1957, while he's touring Australia, Richard claims he saw the engines of his plane glowing red, and he felt that angels were holding it up. Then, at the end of his Sydney performance, he saw a bright red fireball streaking across the sky.
And he was profoundly shaken. He saw the fireball, which was later identified as Sputnik 1, the first artificial Earth satellite, as an immediate, literal sign from God.
a sign to repent, to turn away from the devil's music, and to abandon secular performing immediately.
And he acted on this terror instantly.
He did. He tossed $8,000 worth of jewelry into the Hunter River in Newcastle, Australia, returned to the U.S., performed a farewell at the Apollo Theater, and by early 1958, he enrolled at Oakwood College.
A Seventh-day Adventist college in Alabama to study theology.
He became a vegetarian, a minister, and formed the Little Richard evangelistic team. It was a complete 180 turn that just bewildered the entire music world.
But how did that specific event-seeing Sputnik manage to completely derail a career that was just exploding?
Well, the sources indicate the decision wasn't purely spiritual. That profound spiritual terror was inextricably linked with the financial reality that many artists of the 1950s faced.
So what was the financial context that made leaving Specialty Records so appealing, or even necessary?
Richard later admitted that his reasons for leaving were partially monetary. While he was selling millions of records, he was signed under these exploitative contracts that were typical of the 1950s.
Contracts often engineered to keep black artists perpetually working for little return.
Precisely. He complained vehemently that while he had generated millions, the label had repeatedly reduced his royalty percentage without his knowledge or consent. This wasn't just poor management, it was systemic injustice.
So to end his contract with the label after this conversion,
He agreed to relinquish all future royalties for his material. A decision that was financially devastating, but at the time, it offered him a clean break for his spiritual rebirth.
so the Sputnik moment gave him the spiritual justification to leave the devil's music, but the pervasive financial betrayal gave him the commercial motive to step away entirely.
Exactly. And during this gospel interlude, he tried to find some domestic stability. He married Ernestine Harvin in July 1959. They adopted a son, Danny Jones, providing Richard with a semblance of the traditional family life he had known growing up.
And he didn't stop performing, he just shifted his focus.
Right, he signed with Mercury Records, released King of the Gospel Singers in 1962, which was produced by young Quincy Jones.
Who was apparently highly impressed by Richard's technical vocal power and control.
He was. And even while performing religious music, his unique delivery ensured his material still had crossover appeal. Gospel songs like Crying in the Chapel still managed to reach the pop charts in the UK.
But the stability was fragile. The marriage ended in divorce by 1964.
Yeah, citing his celebrity status, his neglect, and fundamentally the inescapable conflict of his sexuality.
And so the pendulum swings back. The return to secular music was catalyzed in 1962, not in the US, but in Europe, where his records were still selling tremendously well.
A promoter named Don Arden convinced Richard to tour overseas, basically telling him he was still a massive star there.
But Richard initially tried to stick to his commitment, right? He only performed gospel music at first.
He did for the first few shows. But the audiences who had paid to see the architect, they started to boo and complain.
Especially after seeing his opening act, Sam Cooke, receive a completely rapturous secular response.
Right. And that old competitive drive, the one forged on the minstrel circuit and powered by defiance, it just brought the showman roaring back. He launched into Long, Tall Sally, and the audience went into a total frenzy.
They even had to end one show in Mansfield early after fans rushed the stage.
Richard was back in business. But this time, he was influencing a brand new musical revolution.
And this is where his influence truly becomes generational. This 1962 European tour connected him directly to the next wave of rock legends. It's a perfect historical hinge moment.
Absolutely. Brian Epstein, the sharp manager of a little-known band called the Beatles.
I think I've heard of them.
You might have. He arranged for his group to open for Richard on some European dates, including at New Brighton's Tower Ballroom and Hamburg's Star Club.
So Richard essentially ran a masterclass for the Beatles.
He really did. He didn't just let them open. He mentored them on performance. He famously taught Paul McCartney his distinctive vocalizations, specifically the high-register screams and the woo that became signature parts of McCartney's repertoire.
McCartney later admitted he idolized Richard and used his recordings as specific inspiration for up-tempo rockers like I'm Down.
So Richard was literally training the key figures of the British invasion on how to capture that raw American rock energy.
And he continued rebuilding his band, the Upsetters, even bringing in a young Billy Preston on keyboards and later a phenomenal, flashy guitarist named Jimi Hendrix in 1964.
The connection between Little Richard and Jimi Hendrix is legendary, but it was brief and often volatile. Hendrix joined the Upsetters as a full band member between 64 and 65.
And they clash.
Repeatedly,
Yeah.
primarily because Hendrix, who was a burgeoning showman himself, insisted on drawing attention away from the star.
And Richard was notoriously demanding about his band members' punctuality and, ironically, their wardrobe. He insisted on the uniform, and Hendrix preferred his own flamboyant clothes.
But the deeper source of conflict was, once again, financial. Richard had a habit of paying his musicians poorly and inconsistently. Hendrix complained bitterly about his pay.
His father later noted that Jimmy quit Richard because you can't live on promises when you're on the road.
Right. When Hendrix left in early 1965, he was allegedly owed $1,000. It's absolutely wild to think that the architect of rock and roll fired the future architect of psychedelic rock over a small debt.
It just reveals the persistent financial instability underlying Richard's career.
Meanwhile, his own recordings were struggling against the cultural tide he had unleashed. His new records in the mid to late 60s were poorly promoted. He was struggling against the massive success of the British invasion bands he had mentored.
And the rise of powerful, sophisticated soul labels like Motown and Stax. The landscape had changed drastically in the decades since Tutti Frutti.
Domestically, this meant he was often relegated to the Chitlin circuit, that network of black-owned venues that served as the primary performance circuit for black entertainers during segregation.
And while he continued to play huge venues overseas, being relegated to the Chitlin circuit in the U.S. was a specific blow to his status.
And there's a peculiar irony here. His flamboyant, androgynous look, which was so radical in 1955, was actually deemed inappropriate by some more conservative black record buyers during the Black Liberation Movement.
So some black radio DJs refused to play his music.
Exactly. He couldn't win. He was too black for white mainstream radio and too flamboyant for some segments of the black market.
So his survival was built on live performance.
Entirely. He shifted his focus to these electrifying shows, securing lucrative spots in places like Las Vegas and at major rock festivals. He famously stole the show from headliner Janis Joplin at the Atlantic City Pop Festival.
And impressed John Lennon at the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival.
And these appearances propelled him back into the celebrity spotlight, leading to significant talk show spots on Carson and Dick Cavett.
This momentum led to a brief resurgence with Reprise Records in 1970, where he released the album The Real Thing.
And the single Freedom Blues was his biggest hit in years. A philosophical, upbeat track that landed him on the coveted cover of Rolling Stone magazine in May 1970.
But the personal chaos was escalating dramatically just as his career stabilized.
Yeah, this is where it gets dark. Richard had been famously clean a teetotaler during his 1950s zenith. He even fined his bandmates for drug or alcohol use.
But by the mid-1960s, he began drinking and smoking marijuana heavily.
And this quickly spiraled into a devastating, career-destroying addiction. By 1972, he was addicted to cocaine. He later lamented, "They should have called me Lil Cocaine. I was sniffing so much of that stuff."
By 1975, the addiction had deepened into a tragic abyss, encompassing heroin and PCP, or angel dust.
Costing him up to $1,000 a day. His use was so severe that he recalled, "I lost my reasoning." This period was marked by paranoia, irrational decisions, and a profound collapse in his ability to manage his career or his life.
The drug abuse led to genuine life-threatening chaos.
Absolutely. It culminated in 1977, when his longtime friend and fellow musician Larry Williams, who was also addicted and wildly unpredictable, showed up with a gun and threatened to kill Richard over a drug debt.
Richard said this was the most fearful moment of his entire life.
I can imagine. And that terrifying moment, coupled with a devastating string of personal tragedies, the death of his brother Tony, the accidental shooting of his nephew, whom he loved like a son, and the murder of two close friends, it forced a second necessary intervention.
This convinced Richard to quit drugs and alcohol cold turkey.
And once again, he abandoned rock and roll and returned to evangelism in 1977. He fully embraced the ministry again, touring as a minister and releasing the gospel album God's Beautiful City in 1979.
However, this time, the spiritual rebirth was immediately followed by a legal reckoning.
Yes. In 1984, Richard took major legal action. He filed a massive $112 million lawsuit against Specialty Records for those unpaid royalties he had relinquished back in 1957.
The suit was ultimately settled out of court in 1986. But the sheer size of that lawsuit really highlights the scale of the financial betrayal he endured.
And his return to the spotlight was solidified in 1984 with the authorized biography, Quasar of Rock, which led to what Rolling Stone called a formidable comeback.
And this time, Richards found a way to reconcile his two roles, saying rock music itself was neutral and could be used for good or evil.
He won critical acclaim in the film Down and Out in Beverly Hills in '86 and penned a faith-based rock song, Great Gosh Almighty, for the soundtrack, which became a hit on US and UK charts.
The late career period was defined by this remarkable versatility and a willingness to embrace new sounds.
Yeah, his album Lifetime Friend from '86 included a track that featured gospel rap. I mean, think about Little Richard recording gospel rap in 1986. Still ahead of the curve.
He also provided background vocals on that U2 and B.B. King track, When Love Comes to Town.
Performed a spoken word rap on Living Colour's Elvis is Dead.
And, maybe most famously, sang the iconic theme song for the Magic School Bus in 1994, bringing his unmistakable energy to an entirely new generation of kids.
The story of Little Richard is truly a story of incredible high-voltage dualities. And nowhere is that conflict clearer than in his personal identity, suspended constantly between this radical pioneering sexuality and deep, passionate, conservative religion.
It's a profound internal conflict that defined his entire life and career. As we noted, he was tormented and abused as a child for his effeminate mannerisms, culminating in his father kicking him out for being gay.
And that trauma fueled his need for external validation through performance, creating Princess Lavone.
And even after his first conversion and his time at Oakwood College studying theology, that spiritual escape, the internal conflict continued to rage.
Yet the sources cite his departure from Oakwood after an incident involving exposing himself to a male student.
And furthermore, the sources detail an arrest in 1962 for spying on men urinating in a bus station bathroom, an incident linked to an obsession with voyeurism that Richard himself admitted dated back to the early 1950s.
So the showman and the sinner were constantly at war with the preacher and the student of theology.
And his public statements on his own sexuality were just a whirlwind of contradiction reflecting that internal war.
On Late Night with David Letterman in '82, post-conversion, he claimed, "I'm not gay now. God let me know that he made Adam be with Eve, not Steve."
Yet only 2 years later, in his authorized 1984 biography, he claimed he was omnisexual.
And then in a 1995 Ten House interview, he stated plainly that he always knew I was gay. This isn't just changing his mind, it's a public performance of an agonizing, lifelong internal battle.
And then, late in his life, appearing in a wheelchair on a Christian media network in 2017, Richard delivered what seemed to be his final public word on the matter.
He denounced homosexuality and transgender identity as unnatural affection that went against the way God wants you to live. It's a heartbreaking and complex coda delivered by an artist whose persona was so integral to pioneering LGBTQ visibility in the mainstream music industry decades earlier.
But while the duality of his identity is undeniable, it does not diminish the sheer power and scope of his musical and social impact. That impact is historically undeniable. It's foundational to the world we live in today.
Absolutely.
So let's bring it back to the concrete legacy that earned him that title, architect. It begins with musical innovation that fundamentally changed the rhythm of popular music.
Richard's most profound contribution was sonic. It was rhythm itself. He established the standard rock beat.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Well, earlier styles, particularly boogie-woogie, used what we call a shuffle rhythm. You can think of the boogie-woogie shuffle as a relaxed, slightly swung feel. It's like the sound of a train rolling gently down the track. Dum-da-dum-da-dum-da.
Right.
Richard radically flattened that swing into a straight, even division. A rigid, almost militaristic beat that made the music feel like it was perpetually accelerating.
And that crucial physical shift, pounded out by his frantic, high-register, two-handed piano style, became the standard foundation for the genre.
A foundation later cemented by artists like Chuck Berry.
And his voice. That incredible raw instrument was so central. His ability to generate croons, wails, and screams unprecedented in popular music didn't just define rock vocals, it literally drove the formation of other distinct genres.
Specifically soul and funk. The influence map is genuinely astounding.
Let's look at soul and funk.
Okay, Otis Redding, one of the pioneers of soul, stated that most of his music was patterned after Richard's. He referred to Richard's earlier recordings as the personification of soul.
And James Brown.
The godfather of soul and his mid-1950s backing band, the Upsetters, are universally credited as the first to take Richard's intense rock beat and infuse it with funk by emphasizing the downbeat and driving syncopation. Without Richard's rhythm, there is no foundation for the funk revolution.
Then you look at the British invasion. who learned how to rock by basically studying Richard's records like textbooks.
Paul McCartney idolized him in school, calling his voice a wild horse screaming thing.
Yeah.
It's like an out-of-body experience. John Lennon recalled that upon hearing Long Tall Sally for the first time in 1956, he was so impressed he couldn't speak.
Even Mick Jagger called Richard the originator and my first idol. The entire foundation of 60s rock came from trying to copy Richard Penniman.
And that influence mapped directly onto hard rock and heavy metal, genres that rely on that primal scream and driving beat.
Right.
Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin recalled getting goosebumps from head to toe when he heard, "Good golly, Miss Molly." John Lord of Deep Purple went so far as to state, "There would have been no Deep Purple if there had been no Little Richard."
AC/DC's Angus Young was inspired to play guitar by him.
And his brother Malcolm Young derived his signature rhythm sound directly from trying to emulate Richard's fast, hammering piano work.
And of course, the world of glam and modern pop. David Bowie, the master of persona and theatricality, said Richard was his inspiration and that when he first heard Tutti Frutti, he heard God.
Elton John, after opening for Richard, decided then and there that he wanted to be a rock and roll piano player. And the connection to Prince through the androgynous look, the theatricality, the dynamic vocal style is absolutely clear.
Bruno Mars, in his performance of Runaway Baby, is frequently cited by critics as directly channeling Little Richard.
This broad, deep, and continuous influence confirms his stature. But his societal impact is just as crucial to his legacy as the music. His charisma, his dynamic showmanship, his sheer magnetic pull.
It drew integrated mixed-race audiences, helping to break the color line in public venues and profoundly changing American culture forever.
For which he was later honored by the National Museum of African American Music. He forced America to dance together.
Richard's final years were marked by a body that was finally slowing down after 7 decades of high-speed performance. He suffered a serious car crash in 1985 that left him with a broken leg and head injuries.
Later, sciatica required him to use crutches, followed by hip replacement surgery around 2009-2010, which limited him to performing only while seated.
Even in his late 70s and 80s, he continued to make public appearances, still full of that trademark fire.
He suffered a heart attack in 2013, which he claimed aspirin and his son saved him from. He received numerous well-deserved lifetime honors. The Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in '93, the R&B Foundation Pioneer Award in '94, the AMA Merit Award in '97.
His most famous songs, Tutti Frutti, Lucille, and Long Tall Sally, are enshrined in the Grammy Hall of Fame.
Richard Wayne Penniman, the one and only Little Richard, died on May 9, 2020, at the age of 87 from bone cancer.
So what does this all mean? When you look back at the chaotic, electric, and contradictory life of Little Richard, we see how he defined rock and roll not just through sound, but through the sheer audacity of his persona.
He created a sonic and visual template that forced the convergence of white and black audiences and the convergence of masculine and feminine presentation, even in the highly segregated and deeply conservative 1950s South.
His career was a continuous high-voltage struggle, a battle between the spirit and the flesh, the preacher and the showman, the deacon's son and Princess Lavone.
But ironically, that profound, agonizing tension is precisely what made his art so primal, so explosive, and so universally appealing. His legacy is the freedom to be loud, flamboyant, and musically uncompromising.
He gave the world permission to scream.
He really did. He gave the world permission to rock, and perhaps more importantly, he gave the world permission to cross lines that society had deemed rigid and permanent.
And this leaves us with the final complex observation, the most haunting contradiction to wrestle with.
Right. Despite his monumental, boundary-shattering career that explicitly brought marginalized sounds and identities to the mainstream, we have to consider how the influence of an artist, who was a key figure of LGBTQ visibility, changes when, late in his life, he publicly and fervently denounces the very lifestyles, specifically homosexuality, that were integral to fueling his unique, pioneering persona and his greatest artistic creations.
That complex paradox of denial versus indelible legacy is something for you, the learner, to mull over long after this deep dive is complete.